don't we get started? I'm really very happy to have our distinguished lecturer today. We have Ron Minsky from Jane Street Capital. I'm going to let Carl Curry, who was a classmate of Ron's at Cornell, introduce the speaker. But I thought I would just say something about Jane Street. I think many of you know about Jane Street Capital since they are very visible, especially with all the interest in financial markets and so on today. One thing I did learn, though, Ron, which I just found cooler beyond belief, or maybe my wife would say geeky beyond belief, is that they actually own the Google ad search term
Curry-Howard isomorphism.
Curry-Howard isomorphism. And so go ahead and do your search for Curry-Howard isomorphism, and you'll get a nice ad for Jane Street Capital. And so now I'd like to ask Carl to introduce our speaker.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Ron Minsky. As Peter mentioned, Ron and I were contemporaries at Cornell as graduate students. I'd like to iterate an embarrassing story of some kind. I'm sorry to say that, at least off the top of my head, I can't remember any embarrassing stories about Ron, and I know he has them about me. So I'm not going to start a fight in that regard. Ron's going to talk about some of the work they've been doing at Jane Street involving, functional programming and trading. What Jane Street's found out that we find really exciting is that it's really an important part of their business model to have software and indeed to have correct high-performance software. And he's going to talk about how they go about realizing that and making huge amounts of money even in a bad market. So, Ron.
All right. Thank you guys very much for the lovely introduction. So what I want to talk about today is basically the approach that we've taken at Jane Street towards technology and towards developing software. And in particular, I want to talk about a transformation that occurred to the company over the last several years. So when Jane Street started out, we took and this was really before I was at the firm, we took a very kind of traditional mainstream approach towards developing software. We used the most mainstream of tools. You know, we wrote lots of things in VB, in the back end of spreadsheets. We wrote in C#. We wrote in Java. We wrote in C++. All the kind of industry standard languages that people use in the financial markets. And what we've done over the last several years is we have made a kind of profound switch. We have gone from using those mainstream technologies essentially entirely over to using OCaml, an almost comically unpopular programming language, as our primary development language. So I think Jane Street's story, sort of the kind of case study that I'm going to unfold here, is interesting not just because it's an example of the application of functional programming languages, and in particular statically typed functional programming languages, to industrial applications, because there are actually plenty of those. But because the Jane Street story is really a different kind of application than the one that you typically see. The places where you typically see this class of languages getting a real foothold are typically places in industry where you have some application which is deeply tied to an academic field, where that academic field has a historical connection to these languages. So whether it's Lisp and AI, or the sort of ML family of languages and static verification and compilers and things like that, you tend to find these in kind of specific kinds of linked applications. Where Jane Street, we're completely unconnected to any of these things, right? We're a trading company, right? There is no academic field that uses functional programming that is in any way connected to the things that we do. And we use these languages because we think they are the best possible thing for the problems that we have. But these are not the kind of problems that these languages were invented for. And so it's a kind of more general story about the way these languages can end up being used in the real world. So I'd like to proceed in three parts. First, I'm going to talk about what kind of company Jane Street is, talk about what's the business that we're in. Because I think it's important to do that because it's hard to understand the technology decisions that a company makes without, on some level, understanding what the company actually does. And then I want to talk about the kind of technological requirements that this business has. Like, what is it that we as a trading company needs from our technology? And then finally, I'm going to talk about the ways in which OCaml is a good and sometimes a not so good fit for our requirements. So I'm first going to talk about explaining who we are. So we're a trading company, and one might wonder what that means. At the kind of highest, most abstract level, a company that trades is basically a company that makes its money by buying and selling securities. But this definition is so abstract as to be almost entirely useless. So if you want to get a better sense of what we do, it's useful to think about what are the different reasons that people trade on the financial market. So what I have up here on the board is a fairly standard taxonomy of the different kinds of players that show up in the financial markets. And this is an idealized taxonomy. It's not like some real person falls exactly into one category or another, and it's not like these categories are quite exhaustive. But you can kind of think of them as eigenvectors, right? These are kind of the big, important, different, independent kinds of motivations that people have for making trades. So the first one I want to talk about is, the first role I want to talk about in the market is the role of the investor. And this is, in a real sense, the most important of the different kinds of activities on the market, because it is for the investor's purpose that this entire game is being played. And what the investor wants to do is the investor wants to take part in the basic exchange between the willingness to put his capital at risk and receiving an expected return. It's worth noting that in this description, nowhere did I say the goal of the investor is to take advantage of the fact that he understands what things are worth and what investments are good, and he knows where to put his money to use it most effectively. He's just trying to make this very basic exchange of putting capital at risk and making money from it. And when you think about what the kind of prototypical action of the rational investor is, I think of that as being going off and investing shares in some index fund. Right? What you're doing there is you're making, in as efficient a way as you can, in the most diverse ways you can, just making a broad bet on the market and not trying to, in any particular way, pick winners or losers. So if the investor is the guy who's defined by the fact that he doesn't think he's smarter than anybody else, the speculator is the opposite. The speculator is the one who specifically tries to make money from understanding more about what things are worth than other people. So the speculator looks out onto the world of things that are traded and says, I think that one is mispriced. And if it's undervalued, he decides to buy it, and if it's overvalued, he sells it. And then the speculator will then wait and hope that the rest of the world eventually catches up to his understanding. So when the prices become rationalized and the speculator no longer thinks there's any expectancy in that position, that there's no further to be gained from it, then he wants to get out. And it's important that the speculator, that the rest of the world catch up to the speculator, because otherwise he has to hold on to the position forever. And that's not really a good enough business for him. Like, the speculator wants to be able to do this over and over and over again. So imagine you had figured out that IBM is really worth more than people think it is. Then you might, if you were just interested in taking advantage of the fact in the simplest possible way, you might buy it and then hold on to it forever and happily absorb the stream of dividends that came from IBM. But that's going to take 40 years for you to achieve the value. And what about the next thing that you figure out that is undervalued? You'd like to be able to go off and take advantage of that as well. So the speculator needs not merely to be right, but he has to be right in a way that the rest of the world is eventually going to catch up on. So if you look at these two roles, the first role is almost entirely a non-professional role. There is no reason to hire someone to go put your shares, to go buy shares of an index fund for you. You can do that yourself. There's no professional role here. The speculator is a more mixed role. There are a lot of people who are kind of amateurs who, on their own accounts, speculate on the markets. And there are lots of professionals who run hedge funds whose business is speculating. Some of them haven't been doing so well lately, but nonetheless, it's a very common professional role. The next role that I want to talk about is the market maker, and this is a highly professionalized role. And the role of the market maker is essentially someone whose job is to make money by facilitating the trades of others. And how does the market maker do this? Well, he puts out a two-sided market. He expresses the willingness to both buy and sell a given security, where the price he's willing to buy at is lower than the price he's willing to sell at. And the goal of the market maker is to buy and sell many times and essentially collect this spread between the price he's willing to buy and the price he's willing to sell as often as he can. And so if you're a market maker in the financial markets, you might call this gap between the price you're buying and the price you're selling the spread. If you're a bookie, you'll call it the VIG. And if you're in a grocery store, you'll call it a markup. But it's the same thing in all cases. right? It's this basic gap that sort of determines the efficiency of the role you have, right? The tighter that spread, the more attractive are the prices that you're offering. And the goal of the market maker is really to make spreads that are tight enough that he attracts liquidity, that people come and trade against him, so he can do as much volume as he wants, right? The market maker isn't interested, by and large, in predicting what's going to happen in the future. He just wants to do a lot of business and collect a lot of spreads. Just like if you're running a grocery store, you don't make your money by predicting what tomatoes are going to be worth 6 months from now. You make your money by buying the tomatoes and storing them and managing your inventory well and running a nice store and keeping your expenses down and all that kind of day-to-day stuff of running a business. And it's very similar in the role of a market maker. Although it's worth noting, it doesn't mean that the market maker is not exposed to fluctuations in the price, right? Or the guy who runs the grocery store, for that matter. If you get in a big shipment of tomatoes and suddenly the price goes way down, well, you're kind of miserable now. Because now everyone else can buy tomatoes cheaper than you, than the shipment that you just got. And that means you're not going to be able to sell the tomatoes at the price you expected to. You're going to have a loss. So it is possible to lose to price fluctuations. But by and large, market makers don't make money by predicting price fluctuations. What they try and do is not get run over. They try and keep their inventory low and avoid the situation where they get loaded up with some position that then moves against them. So there's another highly professional role out there, and that's the role of the arbitrageur. And to explain what an arbitrageur is, I have to first explain what an arbitrage is. So in arbitrage, to see what an arbitrage is, it's useful to look at an example. And a classic example of arbitrage is what's called currency arbitrage. So there are all these different currencies in the world, and there are lots of different places that you can go to exchange one currency for another. So you can imagine that you might be able to go to one place and take your dollars and convert them into pounds. And then maybe you could go to some other market and take your pounds and convert them into yen. And you could perhaps go to yet a third market and take your yen and convert them back into dollars. That trade counts as an arbitrage if at the end of those transactions you end up with more money than you started with. Right? Now, this is obviously a nice thing. Like, it sounds kind of like free money. And it sounds like free money because, well, when it's there, it sort of is free money, but actually it's usually not there. And it's usually not there because there are people whose business is looking for these opportunities and executing against them when they show up. And by virtue of executing against them, you drive the opportunities out of the market. And what's essentially going on there is you're making the market more efficient because the fact that this opportunity exists basically means that something has been horribly mispriced. Right? This really isn't a rational price if you can sort of run things around a cycle and end up with more money than you started. So that's what arbitrage is, and obviously an arbitrageur is someone who does that kind of trading. So our arbitrage and market making are actually very, very closely linked when you're doing market making on something in which there are arbitrage opportunities. And the reason for that is you can often use the arbitrage relationships to understand the price of the things being traded. So imagine, back to the currency example, where you have these three different currencies, three different markets where the exchange rates are being traded. The two of these markets are highly liquid. There's lots of transactions going on all the time. Lots of people are trading. Lots of value is flowing through those markets. And imagine the third market is very illiquid, that that not a lot of transactions are going on there. A good rule of thumb in finance is that markets that are less liquid have less reliable prices. So one thing that you could do is you could then take the prices from the two more liquid markets and use that to infer a price on the illiquid market. And now you can use that illiquid market as a guide to what the thing is worth. And once you have an understanding of what it's worth, that can feed into your market making. In fact, it had better feed into your market making because otherwise other people will know that and you won't, and they will only trade against you when you lose, and you'll be very, very sad. So when you are doing market making in something that has an arbitrage relationship, these two activities are very tightly related. So Jane Street is really involved in the last two of these activities. We're not investors, obviously, because there's no point in having professional investors, and we really don't involve in speculation. One thing to note about market making and arbitrage is that they are both very kind of short time frame activities. You're thinking about what's happening, over a period of seconds or minutes, and in fact, we'll often have opinions about what we think is going to happen to the evolution of a price of a stock over a few seconds, or over a few minutes, or even over a few hours. And in some weird cases, we think we know what's going to happen over a few days. But we never have any clue what's going to happen in 3 months. And 3 years is completely beyond our comprehension of how to make predictions about. And to be clear, there are people who specialize in these kind of long-term predictions, and some of them do well and some of them do poorly, and it's sort of hard to evaluate what's going on there. But our business has nothing to do with that. We just have no idea how that works. Another thing worth mentioning about Jane Street. So Jane Street's a trading company. We're also what's called a proprietary trading company, meaning that we don't have any customers and we don't have any investors. So that's a little bit weird because it's hard to have a business without any customers and without any investors. So neither of those is quite right. So we don't have explicit customers, meaning there's no one who thinks of us as the guy that provides them service. We obviously do have, the whole business of market making, providing liquidity into the market, has implicit customers all over the place. Anytime somebody goes off and invests money in their 401k and then Vanguard goes off and buys shares in the market for some index fund that you've invested in, well, those trades are happening in the market, and the efficiency of those trades is improved by the fact that there are people out there making tight markets. And so in that implicit sense, there's someone to whom we provide service, and it's really that service that we're being paid for. But there's no one who thinks of us. When we trade against those people, they don't know we're the service provider, and we don't know they're the customer. And there's no one to whom we have a fiduciary relationship outside of ourselves. And the same on the investment side. The money that we use, the working capital for the firm, basically comes from the people who manage the firm on a day-to-day basis. And I think this is all important because it feeds into the kind of technology decisions that we've been able to make. We are very free to think about things from first principles and try and make the decision that we think is most right. And we don't have this feeling that someone is looking over our shoulders at the decisions that we make. And I think that has a lot of impact onto the kind of decisions that we've actually made in practice. Oh, so one other quick note, just about the general scope of the organization. We have about 190 employees. We have offices in New York and in London and in Tokyo and a small office in Chicago. So it's a fairly kind of global operation. So it's still a small company, but beyond the kind of very small initial stages of growth of a company like this. So there is quite a substantial amount of technology that needs to be built. And we have about 35 people for whom a large fraction of their job description is writing software in OCaml. And it's worth noting that this effort is not restricted to some little corner of the company. We use OCaml for almost everything. Like if we're writing a systems administration tool or a monitoring tool or a trading system or a research system or anything, the first tool that we reach for is OCaml. It's not the only tool we use, but it is the primary tool that we go for and is one we choose quite a bit. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to say broadly about the firm. Now I want to talk a little bit about the technological requirements that the kind of business that we're in imposes. So the first, and in some sense the most important thing I want to talk about is correctness. So we worry a lot about correctness of code, and this is something that precedes my tenure at the firm. And the reason we worry about it is there is no faster way to light yourself on fire than to make the same stupid trading decision over and over again in a tight loop. Right? You can easily just burn through all your money really, really fast. It is terrifying to write software that directly interacts with the market. And we are very scared about that and have been for a very long time. And so we have put a lot of energy into writing correct software. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the operation and how much there is at stake, if you look at over just the U.S. domestic equity markets, we do trade more things than equities in the U.S., but just in those markets, if 1 to 2% of the trades that occur in the domestic equity markets have Jane Street on one side or the other of the trade. We trade something like 200 to 400 million shares a day, something like $4 to $8 billion of nominal value kind of flows back and forth every day through our systems. So to be clear, it's not that we're putting on, enormous positions. Like there's a lot of back and forth trading. But you could make a small mistake a lot, and very, very bad things would happen to you. Like you would vanish very, very quickly. And so this has made us very paranoid about the quality of the code that we run. And one other aspect. It's very important to be fast in this business. You have to get to the markets quickly in order to make your trades get through, in order to have the most effective execution. But just as speed is important, speed also kills. Right? Because the tighter that loop is that you can make the stupid decision in, the more quickly, the harder it is that you blow up and the harder it is for a human being to notice and intercede and stop it. So it becomes all the more critical the faster you get to do a better job at writing your software. So the next thing I want to talk about, I missed a bullet already, is agility. And by agility, I essentially mean the ability to quickly change and modify and update your code in response to changing circumstances. There are lots of drivers of change. We have 190 employees, and a large part of what we hire them to do is to think about new ways for us to make money. And painfully, inevitably, many of those new ways require us to change our software. Right? So new ideas is one big driver of change. But there are lots of other drivers. The world changes underneath our feet. New regulations come in, new kinds of securities pop up, new places to trade those securities, changes to the way the places that we're already trading work. And many, many of these changes require us to change our software. And the rate of change is quite blistering. If you think about the way you had to execute a share of stock 10 years ago, it was phenomenally different. So when you went to trade a share of stock 10 years ago, there were two places you could go, the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. They were both manual places. The New York Stock Exchange had a character called the specialist who was involved in every single trade that went down. And then the NASDAQ was the fancy, advanced technological place. And what that meant was they had a way of kind of advertising quotes so you could see what people were offering. But when you wanted to execute a trade, you picked up the phone and you called a guy. Right? There was no automatic execution back then. In fact, this lack of automatic execution had some interesting kind of historical effects. Back in the '87 crash, if you looked at sort of the price evolution of the indices that track the New York Stock Exchange stocks and the NASDAQ stocks, you saw a much sharper drop on things on the New York Stock Exchange than you did on the NASDAQ, which was kind of weird because in a big crash, you kind of expect everything to fall roughly the same percent. But then the next day, the NASDAQ index kept on falling. It had this sort of long, long delay in its response. It turns out the reason for this was that NASDAQ market makers, who were obligated to make reasonably tight markets, were terrified in the middle of the crash. They didn't want to make markets because they thought they'd get run over. They didn't know what anything was worth. So they stopped answering their phones. And so like the next day, like things calmed down and they started making markets again, and then things started trading again. So a lot of names on the NASDAQ just stopped trading. Like nothing happened until the next day, and then you sort of saw the rest of the evolution of the fall of the stock price. Prices were already much higher. Stocks traded in increments of a 1/16 of a dollar, which was kind of a strange granularity to pick, and also it meant that the implicit cost of crossing the bid-ask spread was quite high. Today, everything is completely different. The specialist is gone. The NASDAQ is completely electronic. There are all these other exchanges like Archipelago and Instinet and Island, which came and then got bought up and went, and new exchanges around. There's this enormous network of exchanges which all route to each other with complicated routing algorithms that if you want to execute stock at maximal efficiency, you need to understand. And regulations have changed enormously. There's coming out all these kind of new kind of places to trade stocks like dark pools, new kinds of securities. There are things like ETFs which popped up. There's an enormous amount of change. And that's just in the U.S. equity markets. Right? I could tell a similar story for options and another story for international equity markets. And you can just go on and on. Like, everything changes a lot. And that story actually underestimates how fast change is because it's getting faster. Right? As the world becomes more electronic, it's easier for systems to change, and they change more. Right? And every time it changes, you have to keep up with it. So the ability to efficiently update your code to keep up with the world is critical. The next thing I want to talk about is performance. So along with those changes I talked about over the last 10 years, in the equity markets came a real explosion in data rates. So if you look out in the world of equities, there are hundreds of thousands of different securities out there. And if you pull in that data, you're going to get hundreds of thousands of transactions you need to pull over the wire per second. And you need to deal with these transactions in two ways. First of all, you need to be able to react to them, and you need to be able to react fast. You need to be able to sort of go from the data that's coming in the door to your response, if there is one, in on the order of a millisecond. And you also need to take that data and store that data for later use and do research on that data and build models and run simulations and all that and be able to store that data somewhere. And you get something like on the order of a terabyte of raw data a day. Now, all told, this is not such a terrible data problem. Like, if you compare this to the problems they have at the Large Hadron Collider or Google or Pixar, it's kind of small, right? It's at 1 terabyte a day. It's not so bad. But we're not, storing data is not really, our core competency, and we're not really that big of a technology group. And the more you can do all these things, and you can store all this data, and you can run over it all. But the less efficient your code is, the more hardware, the more infrastructure you need to run it. And to be clear, hardware is very cheap, right? You can buy a lot of hardware. But the thing that's not cheap is managing the hardware and managing all the complexity that goes along with that hardware. So it's very important to have high performance, not because the problems are insoluble with high performance, but because it takes too much human effort. And JStreet's not really limited, by and large, by capital, and we're not really limited by opportunities. We're limited by the ability to execute, to get people, smart, reasonable, thoughtful people, to run the systems and figure out the new strategy and manage what's going on. And so people's time is at a huge premium. And so people often have this idea that, who cares about optimizing your code? It doesn't matter. You just throw more hardware at it. But hardware actually costs a lot because it takes a lot from the people you could otherwise have doing other things. OK, so that's what I wanted to say about the technology requirements. Now let's talk for a little bit about why we think OCaml is a good match for these requirements. So again, kind of proceeding in the same order, let me talk a little bit about correctness. So to understand our attitude towards correctness, it's useful to know that we take we have sort of deep in the DNA of the firm is a kind of commitment to high-quality software, and in particular to reading the software. Right? Very early on, before I got to Jane Street, a couple of the partners who had the people who are the principals of the firm, the people who run the place, had committed to reading every line of code of the most critical trading systems before they went into production. And the reason they did that is simple. They were afraid, right? For very good reasons, they were afraid of software. And I think a large part of why we ended up making the technology decisions we did made is that the people who were making the decisions were the same people who were reading the code. And I think it changes a lot in an organization when you have people who take code seriously, not just as a way of getting things done, but as a means of expression, like a way of writing down what you mean, a way of communicating to others what you think the system does. And that changes things a lot. And in the end, I think it affected the very specific decisions that we made. So at one point, we were seriously contemplating migrating certain critical systems from the original VB program sitting in the back end of a spreadsheet to a nice, well-behaved C# program. And one of the things that killed that effort was the difficulty of reading the damn code that came out. And there were two things that killed it. One was verbosity. The fact that there were so many more lines of code to read was a problem. And the other was that people found the object-oriented code quite difficult to follow, in part because of the need to kind of understand all the different layers of dynamic dispatch that were going around. Like, when it calls this function, which function does it actually call? And when we were going through this exercise, I was already at Jane Street, and I remember a keen sense of embarrassment at my inability to come up with a really clean, concise answer to that question. So why do we think OCaml is good for reading? Which I said goes a long way towards correctness. And there are two key things: brevity and types. So first about brevity. OCaml is a very terse language, and languages that allow you to express things concisely, all things being equal, all other things being equal, are easier to read than languages that require lots of verbiage. And I think this is kind of a fairly basic cognitive fact, although to be clear, it's not that any form of concision is better, right? If you take all of your functions and rename them with 2-character names, I do not think your code will be better. But having languages that have powerful tools for abstracting out common patterns and saying things clearly and concisely have a real advantage when you're doing code review. And languages like ML have very powerful tools for doing this. Things like higher-order functions, functors, and also, although probably less popularly here at CMU, I think the macro system turns out to be quite valuable when used in certain constrained ways. So brevity is a big deal. Another aspect actually quite related to brevity has to do with boilerplate. So there's lots of boilerplate code throughout the world. You look in most code bases, and you'll see lots of places where someone has written out almost the same logic in multiple different places. And the basic reason people do this is because there's some regularity in their code, some common pattern that they want to express, that the language they're using does not let them express effectively within the language. So what they do is they just cut and paste. They just repeat the pattern in multiple places. And this is bad for a number of reasons, but one of the ones that I found most surprising is that it turns out that it's very hard to code review carefully this kind of boilerplate code because it's really, really dull. And you basically can't pay people enough to carefully review dull code. We've tried. It does not work. There's some kind of very strong mental habit which causes people to kind of gloss over the repeated bits. And it's really important not to, because it's true the density of interesting information in the boilerplate is low, but there is some. And you need to get it right. If you didn't need to get it right, you wouldn't have needed the boilerplate. You wouldn't have needed to put in modifications into the different copies. And so avoiding boilerplate is key, and ML is very good at that. Now, the other issue is types. Reading code is hard, because what are you doing when you're reading code? You are essentially trying to construct an informal proof of the correctness of the code. And I don't mean correctness in some highfalutin, follows some carefully written out complete spec. I mean, does the code basically do what I expect it to do? Do I understand what this code is doing? And these kind of informal proofs, are quite hard to construct. And anything you can do to offload your proof obligation to somebody else, to some automatic system which will do part of it for you, is a huge win. And there are lots of neat things that you can do with the OCaml type system. And this is kind of a big list of them. There's parametric polymorphism and algebraic data types. There's type inference, which makes it all less painful to use. You have modules, you have functors, and then you have all sorts of neat little idioms that you can use on top, things like phantom types and type indexed values, which let you sort of powerful idioms for expressing all sorts of things that, when you first come to ML, seem like the type system isn't powerful enough to do, but if you learn the right tricks, you can. And this stuff is great. And most of it doesn't matter. Because it's the most basic elements of this that really give you all the juice. Like, if you see why is, and I strongly believe, why is OCaml so much more effective for generating correct code than Java, it mostly has to do with the simplest features. And I think the first two on this list are really the most important ones, parametric polymorphism and algebraic data types. So what I want to do actually is spend a little more time talking in some detail, for those of you who are not already entirely converted, about why algebraic data types are important. So first, and I hope this isn't too much review, what is an algebraic data type? So it's a very simple thing. Basically, you need two kinds of types, or really two kinds of ways of building or constructing types. You need product types and sum types. So a product type is basically what every programming language in the world has in a reasonably direct and straightforward way. It's basically like a record type or a struct in C. It's basically putting a bunch of different things of different types together in one value. And the reason it's called a product type is it corresponds mathematically to a Cartesian product, right? A very sort of simple mathematical correspondence. So the other thing is called a sum type. So a sum type is where instead of saying I want this and this and this, like a product type, you want to say it's this or this or this or this. You're expressing the fact that there are multiple different possibilities. And various programming languages support this to some degree or another. In C, for instance, there are unions, which allow you to express this kind of structure. But few programs do it in a kind of first-class, easily accessible, and effective way. And then, so this basic structure is important, but it's not enough. There's one extra piece, which is extraordinarily valuable, and that is the match statement. So the match statement is a convenient syntax and language infrastructure for doing data structure-driven case analysis. Right? And case analysis is, of course, a very common thing you're doing in your code, right? You have some piece of code, and you need to figure out what state you're in and what to do based on what state you're in. And the syntax of the match statement is very convenient, but more importantly, it provides a number of very powerful static checks. So, for instance, one of the things is, when you do one of these analyses, the compiler checks for you automatically whether or not there are any cases you forgot about. Right? So make sure that your case analysis is exhaustive. It's a very useful property for a case analysis, because if it's not exhaustive, when you hit one of those cases you didn't expect, you're going to throw an exception. It also makes sure that there are no redundant cases, that there are no cases that will never be reached because whatever structure you're talking about in that branch of the case analysis has been covered elsewhere. And finally, it checks to make sure that there are no impossible cases, that you haven't written down something that just doesn't come up with the types. So this sort of sounds nice in the abstract, and people often give examples of this having to do with binary trees and various other nice recursive data structures, which in some sense miss the point, because it makes it sound like when you're building complicated data structures, then you need this. No. You need this all the time when you're doing the most simple, prosaic structuring of your code. And so I want to give a very simple, prosaic example. So I'm going to actually have a bunch of code here on the screen. We'll see how this works. I know this is a hard thing to do in a lecture, but I'm going to try and keep it as simple as I can. So this is a simple example of algebraic data types. So we start out with two product types. And these are coming from a financial setting. So there's an order and a cancel. And these are very simplified. For a real order, you need a bunch of other data on it, but just to keep things short. So here on the order, we have an ID field, which is an integer, a price, which is the price at which you're willing to purchase the thing in question, which is a float, and then a size, which is really the number of shares that you're willing to transact, which is an integer. And then the cancel is a kind of trivial product type with only one element. And here it has this XID field, which is the cancel is basically an instruction to get rid of an order that you've sent previously. And so here the XID is the identifier for the order that you are trying to cancel. So these are two kinds of instructions that you can send to an exchange. You very often want to process streams of these instructions, right? So it's natural to have some type that unifies these two possibilities together. And so we can add a type like this. We're going to call it an instruction. And what you see here is on the second and third lines here, on the left-hand side of the of is what's called the type constructor. And this is really a tag that allows you to separate the different parts of the type. So types like this are often called tagged unions, because the way you separate out the two different sets that you are adding together is by putting a tag on them to keep it clear which one's which. So we have the tag order for the type order and the tag cancel for the type cancel. And now I'm going to write a simple function that uses this type and does something useful. So here the function is called filter by OID, and it takes a list of instructions and an integer, which is the order ID. And what the function is supposed to return is the list of instructions that reference that order ID. And the code is very simple. It uses a function from the standard library filter. And what filter takes as its argument is a list of things of some type, and then a function that evaluates things of those types and returns either true or false. And then what filter does is it returns the things for which, it returns a list containing only the things for which the function returned true. Right? So it's a fairly simple function. And here you'll see in the middle of it, there's this match statement. We match X with, and if it's an order O, then we check whether or not the ID field is equal to OID. And if it's a cancel C, we check if the XID is equal to OID. Now this is a really, really trivial example of a match statement. You can do much, much fancier things, but the utility of this approach shows up even when you're doing very simple things. So to see why this is useful, let's see what happens when we need to change our code. So it turns out we forgot one of the possible kinds of transactions you can have on the markets. There's another kind of transaction called a cancel replace. And a cancel replace is basically a request for the exchange to do an atomic transaction where it gets rid of one order and replaces it with essentially a new version of the order with a new price and a new size. And that's what the fields in there are meant to represent. And then we can also go and add this to our variant. So now, when we go over this list of instructions, we can include cancel replaces. So what happens now to this code? Well, what happens is the compiler notices that this code does not work. Right? It says, oh, there's a pattern you missed. There's another possibility that could come up and that you didn't mention to us. And in fact, you'll also get a different kind of error if the evolution goes the other way, right? If instead of adding a variant, we decide we don't need these cancel replaces anymore, and we get rid of it, but the code was already set up to handle it, then it will warn us about the impossible case. It'll say, you're trying to match a cancel replace, but there is no cancel replace in this variant. And this is really an amazingly powerful tool for sort of pushing simple invariants through your code and making sure that as you update the core types of your code, that all of the different codes scattered throughout your code base is going to be modified, because if you don't modify it, it's not going to compile. And in fact, these kind of type constraints are a very powerful refactoring tool, because it's kind of this kind of flow of constraints throughout the system allows you to find the places where you need to make changes. Now, this isn't quite as free as it sounds, because you actually have to be careful in how you write your code in order to get this benefit. There are ways that you can kind of defeat the exhaustiveness checking that the compiler does. You could, for instance, stick in a catch-all case that says, and for anything else, I don't know, do something. Say false. Right? And then your code is going to be fragile, because when you change the types underneath, you're not going to be warned that you need to change the code. But if you follow sensible disciplines, then you can get an enormous amount out of the type system. And I think this is the thing that people often misunderstand when they first see a language like ML. They basically envision a language like this as having two layers. Like, there's this programming language, which I can write programs. And then there's this type system, which sits on top and tells me whether or not the compiler will accept my programs. And this is nice sometimes when the compiler stops me from writing programs that are wrong, because sometimes it does that. And sometimes it's really annoying, because sometimes I write a program that is sensible, that does have a reasonable meaning, and the type system, because it's conservative, rejects it. But anyone who is any good at programming in ML quickly gets beyond this view. In order to be a decent ML programmer, you have to view the type system as a tool of its own. Right? You need to be any good. You have to be actively thinking about how to encode your proof obligations into the type system. And if you don't do that, like, there's almost no point in using the language. Okay. So that's most of what I wanted to say about correctness. As I said, there's lots of other nice things in the type system, and they're valuable, and we use them. But it's really these basic things that are most important. The next thing I want to talk about is agility, and I basically just want to repeat everything I said about correctness. Because the most important thing in being able to change your code quickly when changes are required is the ability to gain confidence quickly that your code is actually correct at the end. So this is really a big deal, and I think is worth a lot. The fact that, as I showed before, when your code evolves, you have all these static guarantees to help you keep things up to date and to become confident that they're right is worth a lot. There's one other thing I want to mention, which goes back to this issue of boilerplate. So boilerplate isn't just bad for getting people to read it. It's also bad for changing your code. Because the whole reason you have the boilerplate is there's some pattern that you want to be repeating in lots of different places. And what happens when you need to change that pattern? If it's all just kind of implicitly cut and pasted around, you need to go through your code and find all the different places where the pattern shows up, and you need to manually modify and tweak and adjust it. And you are inevitably going to miss things. So a big part of being able to evolve your code is avoiding boilerplate, because it centralizes the decisions into places that are kind of narrow and clear enough that you can think about them clearly when you need to make changes. The last thing I want to talk about is performance. So there are a lot of nice things to say about the performance of OCaml in particular, but I think the most important thing is a more general point, not about the particular OCaml implementation, but about ML in general as a language. And I think ML sits in a kind of sweet spot in language design. It's very expressive, and it has a very declarative feel, which means that you can write code in a very clean, very natural style, in a way that's clear and easy to understand what it means. And at the same time, it has a fairly straight-ahead compilation strategy that produces highly performing code. And it's hard to get these two things together. Like, if you move too far in wanting more expressiveness, then you often have to give up a great deal in terms of the comprehensibility of the performance. And if you want a lot more performance, you often have to give up on the declarative nature of the language. And ML is kind of, in some ways, kind of perfect in this. I don't mean to say it's the be-all and end-all of language design, but I mean it's kind of a local minima. It takes a lot of work to do really substantively better than ML in this regard. And you can see languages that have a very different trade-off. One nice example to think about is SQL. So for some kinds of jobs, SQL allows you to write very high-level, very declarative code, and then a miracle occurs, right? There's this optimizer that sits behind it and does all sorts of fancy compilation, and then you get some performance. Like, you write something down, and then you are like told by virtue of running it how it's going to perform. And it's very hard to predict. And it's not just hard to predict; it's unstable. Right? You could change a little not obvious thing, like a little bit of the structure of your code, and the performance can shift by orders of magnitude. Or even worse, you can change the number of rows in your table. And like the compiler's like, oh, no, I don't want to use hash tables anymore, I want to use B trees. And boom, stuff changes completely. And in fact, we've experienced a lot of this because we do use SQL for a significant number of things. And the unpredictability of the performance is a huge problem. And ML is very good at being a compromise between these two things. So there are other nice things about performance of ML in particular. It's got great code generation. It's a very nice garbage collector. It's actually we found very good ways of tuning it for kind of soft, real-time kind of behavior so we can react to things with very low latencies. But I think the most, and there are lots of kind of specific things about the specific language that make it very pleasant. And there are also some warts that it has in terms of performance. But I think that the important story is this kind of broad picture about ML and not the specific picture about OCaml. So not all is wine and roses. There are various things at which OCaml is not good at, and various problems that you have as someone who uses OCaml a lot. One big problem is building user interfaces. It turns out there aren't really any good libraries for it. There are libraries that sort of wrap this toolkit or that toolkit, and they do a reasonable job of it. But there's no like good like ML-ish libraries that are really good for building industrial strength user interfaces. And that's been an ongoing pain for us. Like, we've done a lot of work. We need to build user interfaces for various things, and it's much easier for us if we can hook into the rest of our infrastructure And it's on the whole caused us a lot of pain. And in fact, many of our most successful user interfaces have been interfaces that use curses, because at least that we know how to write. So that's a place where we'd like to see things get better. Another issue is concurrency. OCaml has no ability to take advantage of physical parallelism. So you can run lots of threads, and that's very good for interacting with low-level C libraries. But you can't actually run OCaml code on multiple cores or processes or processors in a machine at the same time, physically at the same time. So that's one problem. And then another related problem is there aren't really good libraries for taking advantage of concurrency across multiple processors, like forking different processes and then having them communicate by message passing is, I think, a completely reasonable approach to this. And in fact, in many ways, the approach that I prefer. I think shared memory concurrency is extremely scary. But there aren't really good high-level tools for doing this effectively. And I think that's an important place where it would be great to see the language grow. Also, as I said, OCaml and statically typed functional programming languages in particular, in general, are comically unpopular, right? And as a result of that, the communities are fairly small, and they're high quality. There's a lot of great people there. But in the end, the external libraries you can get from the outside world are of limited abundancy, at least, and it's kind of a desert in comparison to all the things you can find for Java or Perl or various other languages that are used by wider groups. And then one other thing is that there, again, related to languages like Java and Perl, there isn't really the kind of support for programming in the large, right? You can write large-scale programs. We have on the order of 1 million lines of code, which is a lot. It's a lot of code in general, but it's really a lot of ML code, because ML code is considerably more dense than, say, code in C. I was actually sort of embarrassed to discover at some point that I think Vim is about 1 million lines, which is kind of disturbing. We're almost up to the editor. But the kind of support, both kind of community support and systems for distributing packages, and also kind of in-language support for thinking about namespaces in the right way, it's all kind of lacking. It's never really been thought through really cleanly. There are some partial solutions, and some of them are reasonably good, but it's really an area where more work is needed. So there are places that need to grow, and it's worth noting the areas that really need to grow are not, in my opinion, by and large, the core language. The core language is so good, so far ahead of the kind of more mainstream competitors, that I think it's just not the place where the biggest advantage is to be gained. But it's worth noting, these are academic languages. They come out of academic institutions. And these are not the kinds of things, these kind of library, user interface issues, these are not the kind of things that academics tend to get excited about, and certainly not that they tend to get paid for. And this is, to some degree, where we want to make some amount of impact here. So for the last few years, we've been running a summer project where we fund students over the summer to work on solving these kinds of issues. And in previous years, this has been called the OCaml Summer Project. This year, we changed the name to reflect a widened scope. So we're now opening up to applications from other functional programming language communities. So it's now the Jane Street Summer Project. But the goal of the project is to fund students working with faculty over the summer on projects that actually substantively increase the usability of these languages as practical tools. Not just as academic playthings, but things that you can actually use in the real world when your goal is not creating a paper or doing some purely academic research on languages, but when your goal is actually to do something else, right? Using functional programming not for functional programming's sake. And because it's not the natural, it's not a natural thing for academia to be incentivized to do, but we know there are a lot of academics who care about it because people care quite deeply about these languages. We want to kind of partner with people and provide some funding for people to do this kind of work when the rest of the academic infrastructure doesn't fund it. There's one other final note I wanted to make, which is that there's one other advantage to OCaml, which was quite important. It's been quite important to us in practice, and it was in fact quite important. It went into our thinking about the decision in the first place, which is that one of the benefits you get by using a language like OCaml is that it turns out you can attract a much higher quality of person to work in a language like OCaml. And I just make the minor advertising point that we are still looking for such people. And that's really all I had to say. Thank you very much for listening.
So we have time for some questions. Also, 5:30, I believe.
I think that's right.
In Neil Simon Hall 3305, there's a kind of student session, and so if you're a student, I guess you're welcome to come. So, Dave.
So, pardon my ignorance. Isn't OCaml the sort of object-oriented extensions to ML?
No.
No.
So OCaml has an object-oriented extension, which nobody uses. And nobody uses because, I mean, Jérôme Villon, who wrote it, did not use it. Like it was considered an interesting experiment, but I think most people who use the language consider it to be a failed experiment. And OCaml, in fact, Caml before it, and Caml, there's like a whole long history that stretches out for quite a while in parallel to the development of standard ML. But it's just a mistake to think of OCaml as the object-oriented extension. It does have that in there, but it's really a whole other language implementation with its own set of trade-offs and differences. And by and large, it's mostly very similar to SML. Like the similarities are much, much bigger than the differences. And we never use the object system.
So then what's the key advantage of Caml over SML?
I'm not sure I want to get into that fight.
There isn't one.
I have a few, but...
No, you're on the hook. I think you do.
All right. So SML and J is not a great implementation. You would not want to use it as not industrial strength. Milton is an all-at-once compiler that has various trade-offs. It wouldn't be crazy to use Milton. Stephen Weeks works at Jane Street, so particularly wouldn't be crazy. But there are various. So one of the reasons that Stephen argued that he might not want to use Milton is because the compilation strategy is so much more complicated that it's harder to be confident about what it's going to do. And OCaml is one of the miracles of OCaml is actually it's not an optimizing compiler at all, and yet its performance is shockingly good. Now, there are places where there are missed optimizations which I would dearly like to get fixed because you have to route around them in very unpleasant ways. But by and large, it performs astonishingly well, given that it's so damn simple. It's also a much better Unix citizen. It kind of hooks well into the C infrastructure in a way that I believe SML doesn't. But really, the answer is we could have probably used one of the SML implementations. And many of these things are path dependent. I was a graduate student at Cornell. I was Mark Hayden's office mate. Mark Hayden wrote Ensemble in OCaml. So I came to Jane Street, and I wrote a bunch of stuff in OCaml because it was all a throwaway project, and nobody cared anyway because no one was ever going to use it. 80,000 lines of code later, it turned out I was wrong. And so, I think there are differences in the language. I do think OCaml turns out to have been a somewhat better choice, but really, similarity is much bigger than differences.
So I take it then you use the bytecode compiler rather than the optimizing compiler? You say it's not an optimizing
So the optimizing compiler is not an optimizing compiler. It's a native code compiler. It doesn't do loop hoisting. It doesn't do anything. It is not an optimizing compiler. It's a native code compiler, and it has great code generation, but it is not an optimizing compiler.
Well, they call it an optimizing.
I mean, Xavier, if you ask him if it's an optimizing compiler, I've certainly seen him say no. Right? It's called OCaml-opt. That's right, but it's often referred to as the native code compiler. And to be clear, it performs shockingly well, and it does do some optimizations, but the optimizations are very unaggressive. And it's actually kind of mysterious how well it performs. One thing that's kind of weird is that if you look at micro benchmarks of Milton against OCaml, OCaml tends to win, and what's really going on there is that these micro benchmarks don't really show Milton at its strength. Because what's great about Milton is not that it's the best optimizer in the world or has the best code generation backend. What's great about Milton is that when you use Milton, certain kinds of abstraction are free. Right? You can like pile layer on layer of abstraction, kind of not worry about. In OCaml, when you use an abstraction, you have to think it's like, oh, I'm paying a little bit right there. Now, again, there's a trade-off because for some of these optimizations, it's hard to predict when they're going to hit and when they're not. And so it goes into the predictability of the performance. But still, the real big win with a whole program optimizing compiler like Milton, I think, is with this abstraction issue more than with kind of the raw performance of simple code.
So if you look at like Java-based communities and things like that, the structure of the community itself, like who talks to who, is often kind of dictated by the structure of the programming language. Fundamentally, people are going to be sharing compilable blocks of code with each other, and it has an effect on how that. I was wondering if having a functional programming language as your base has forced you to like divide your organizations, or enabled you to divide your organization in a way that's different from the way that like standard project teams are divided with other languages.
So we're still a small place. We only have 35 people who spend their time actively programming OCaml code. And our approach to this so far has been to take all of our code, or not all of our code, but the vast majority of our code, and stick it into one enormous HG repo and share it that way. And there's a bunch of advantages you get by that. You get kind of a clear notion of what a snapshot of the system is, and then you can have things like compile daemons that go through and verify that all your unit tests run and everything compiles together, and it makes it easier to make big changes that kind of touch the whole world. And so the one thing I'll say is I'm not sure about what the language enables or doesn't enable, but one thing that we depend a lot on is that we get to see all the code, and we get to modify all the code. And if there's a change that we think is the right change to make that involves going and changing stuff in a bunch of different places, we can do it. So there's a lot of flexibility that you would lose if you had some notion of this thing that we compiled, that we exported, and now, my friend, you cannot touch it because it's the thing that we exported. I think that we get a lot of value out of not doing that, although I think, again, I do think these languages like OCaml do give up something in terms of not having good enough support for programming in the large. So I think at our scale, that's the right way of doing it. But I think at some scales, it would be useful to have other tools. And I think one day it would be nice for languages like OCaml to grow those capabilities.
You cited a couple of problems that you guys had with more traditional O languages. And one of them was this problem of having all of this repeated code everywhere. And there's a lot of argument to the fact that if there is that kind of code where you're repeating the same algorithm lots of places, making minor changes, that was just a poor design, and someone made a mistake in the original design. Now, it sounds like that problem isn't happening with OCaml, and is that a matter of, is something about the language, people aren't making that mistake somehow?
Right.
Is it a culture thing, technology thing? I'm trying to understand
So,
where the issue came up.
I guess step back for a second. Talking about programming languages is a fundamentally contentious business, right? Everyone has their own opinion, whether you're like a dynamic languages person or a functional language or an object-oriented language. Everyone has their own opinion, and it's very hard to make really compelling arguments because different people do different things, and the idioms show up in different ways. And moreover, when you get deep into one corner, like your brain gets deeply affected, right? People get connected to their programming language like they get connected to nothing other than their text editor. Right? It's like there's a way in which it kind of ruins your sense of objectivity. So it's very hard to tell in a way that I can say convincingly that I can prove in some kind of from the data. So it is true. Different people wrote the code at the time, and it was different. It was at a different sort of time in the company's evolution, and we learned lots of things about writing code between writing the first system and writing the second system. So it's hard for me to really prove it to you, and yet, having spent time writing object-oriented code and having spent time writing functional code, it is deeply clear to me that it is easier to factor out common functionality in functional programming languages than in object-oriented programming languages. But to be very clear, I can't prove it any better than that.
You don't know what it is about functional language that is helpful?
Well, functional languages are much terser, and they can express very powerful things. Like one of the key tools, higher-order functions. Very simple and very painful to do in object-oriented. There are actually two key features. When I think about what I don't like about object-oriented languages, in fact, let me say my standard mean thing about object-oriented languages. So there are three key ideas that came out of object-oriented languages. One of them is a great idea. One of them is a nice idea but the wrong default, and the other is a horrible idea. The good idea is abstraction, interfaces. The good idea that's the wrong default is subtyping. Subtyping is nice. Sometimes you want it. But parametric polymorphism is the right default. Think about a function like list.map. You want to have you want to have an alpha list and then a function that takes alpha to beta. You don't want to have an object list and a function that takes object to object. That's just wrong. And almost always what you want is the parametric polymorphism version, not the subtyping solution. And then the idea that's just horrible is inheritance, right? And I think this is something which the object-oriented community has largely figured out, right? You read good books on how to structure object-oriented programs, and people have maxims in them like, prefer containing to inheriting, right? And that's right, because it's very hard to reason about code that has inheritance in it, not just because of all the dynamic dispatch, which is by itself, I would argue, another case of the wrong default. The right default is static, because it's easier to think about what's happening on. There's fewer possibilities. You want as few possibilities in your code as you can, unless you need lots of possibilities. So I think that so the other thing that's bad about inheritance, I'm sorry, is that it kind of breaks interfaces in this way that makes it very hard to reason about what's going on. Because you're kind of reaching into the code and kind of changing things around in a way that makes it just very hard to know what's going on without actually reading the code that you're inheriting from. So, I mean, I really think these various misfeatures of language combined with the extreme verbosity of the language make it much harder to abstract out simple patterns. It's very lightweight. OCaml will just say, I'm just going to create a little function here, which abstracts out what I need to do, and I can just put this here, and then I can call that in the 3 places. And it just takes less energy to do, sort of causes you to pull out your hair less. And I've met very good programmers in other paradigms, and most programmers that I've talked to about how they work use some kind of templates, not all that rarely, more often than would be ideal. So I don't think this is just a feature. I mean, C programmers certainly have to do it. It's kind of no question. Like, there just aren't the abstraction facilities that you need in the language. But in lots of other languages as well, I think it really is hard to do the kind of abstraction that you need. And to be clear, OCaml is not perfect either. There are certain kinds of patterns that you can't do that the various limitations of the language and the type system make impossible. But I think it's a big step up from object-oriented languages. But again, I can say it, but I can't prove it.
I have 2 questions, a half series one and a series one. I'll start with the half series one. Are you convinced that you're wealthier today because of OCaml?
I certainly generated a great deal of job security. No. So, I mean, but seriously, I think the answer is yes. I mean, it's for a lot of reasons, and they're hard to separate out. I think one of the big reasons is we were able to hire, it was much easier to hire great programmers to write in OCaml than it was in, I mean, to be clear, we hired a bunch of very good programmers to work before we switched over. And in fact, those people have switched over to the new paradigm quite well and to writing in the new language. But it took much more blood, sweat, and tears than it did to find really good functional programmers. And that's such a big effect that, it's hard to tell. But that said, I do believe it is an important effect, and I do think that we were able to move faster and be more successful and make more money because our technology, was better as a result of the choice of language we used to build it in.
Okay, so now my more serious question. In the list of problems, most of the problems look scary to me because they were linear effects. For example, with the user interface, you're only going to have a linear number of people having to use your software. So somehow it doesn't seem to be that the problem. One that seems exponential, potentially, is the concurrency problem, because your competitors might actually be able to ride the exponential curve of parallel.
To be very clear, one has no choice but to write code that works on multiple processes. And we do this, right? We do this in our clusters. We do this in our trading. Now, things are made easier for us by the fact that a lot of the problems in this space are embarrassingly parallelizable. And so you can do quite simple things of just replicating fairly simple units and then managing them collectively as a way of kind of taking advantage of all the parallelism that you have at the physical level. And we're going to need to do more in that space. And when I talked about the problems, I'm not worried for us. We have a lot of really good OCaml hackers. We're going to get done what we need to get done. But it is a place where I think the community at large, and us as well, could benefit from some well-thought-out infrastructure for doing this. But it's hardly impossible in the current world, and we do it. And indeed, we would not be where we are now. You have to be on the performance train. And now the performance train means more parallelism. And we're on that train.
Yeah, so how about just 2 more questions? And then,
So in follow-up to Peter's question, I think there's a different kind of scalability involved in programming in the large. So I was curious, what specific issues do you see, and what kinds of changes would you like to see made to the language to support them?
Right. So to be fair, this is an area which it seems clear to me one needs to do better at, but I don't have very well-formed ideas about what to do. And from our own point of view, it's worth noting that one of the reasons we're able to do what we do in terms of the languages we use is most of our time is not spent interfacing with others. Most of our time is spent writing stuff that's just for us, that's specialized to our needs. And because of that, the sort of lack of sort of more exciting stuff on the outside is less of a problem. So I think, but in terms of what could be better, I think that better systems for to make it easier to generate packages that can be shared sort of more transparently, and having a kind of somewhat better approach to namespaces than you currently have. And I think both SML and OCaml both have this problem of not having a really well thought out approach to namespaces. And so I think those are kind of two basic issues I think should be addressed at some point better. Although, to be clear, I haven't thought carefully enough about this to have really focused suggestion on what's the right thing to do there. By the way, another place for things to get better is development tools. How about better error messages? That would be nice. I think OCaml in particular has some real doozies that are kind of indefensible in their incomprehensibility. And you program for it long enough, and it stops to be such a big deal. But I think to make the sort of curve of learning it easier, it'd be great to have some better thought out approaches to explaining to the programmer what went wrong when this type constraint went kablooey. Be great.
Talk a little more about the business decision to use OCaml. And specifically, I'm wondering about when you said that OCaml gives you a lot of job security. So I kind of picture the first meeting where someone's like, "Yeah, let's switch over everything to OCaml," and then the business type saying, "Wait a minute, there's no way if we want to hire, we can get enough programmers to know OCaml."
Right. So the few key things here. First of all, there are no business types, right? I mean, it's a place with a bunch of sort of smart, reasonable, sort of thoughtful people, and who think carefully about the technology, even if it's not the main business that they're in. So there was no meeting with the business types. Also, there was no meeting where we said, let's switch everything over to OCaml. It happened like this. So I showed up, and I started doing my own thing in my own crazy language, in my own crazy way, in ways that nobody else knew what the hell I was doing, so I just supported myself. I fondly remember the 6-high pile of Dell machines. It was my first cluster, right? Just sort of self-help, right? Because it was basically a Windows shop. There was nobody who really had any experience setting up the kind of Unix system. So I just, and it was easy enough for me to set up my own stuff. And then it turns out I wasn't just doing this pastime for a year during my postdoc. It turns out I was going to stay. And once I decided to stay, it was clear I needed to hire some people. So I started hiring a few people, but then it was clear that what we were doing was to work on this kind of research effort that I was involved in, the kind of trading-related research, optimizing trading strategies, coming up with new trading strategies. And so there was a focused area in which we started using OCaml. And then some part of the way through, as we were kind of thrashing around and trying to figure out what the next generation of our technology needed to be, and there really needed to be a next generation, right? We had started up the company with a kind of simplest and kind of very pragmatic, but not long-term solution. All of our systems, all of our kind of core systems were like spreadsheets with VB backends. And when we needed to make a new variation, we copied it. And we edited the code in the places where it needed to be changed. And now we had 2 of them, which were slightly different, right? It was very clear from the start that this was not a long-term sustainable technology choice. And so we all knew we needed to do something different. We were trying to figure out what the right thing to do was. And at some point we realized, we're hiring some fairly good guys to program in OCaml, and it was, not that hard. My first big experience hiring OCaml developers, there were a few forays, and then at some point, I sent an email to the OCaml list, and I got back 15 responses. And 12 of them were worth phone interviewing, and 5 of them were worth bringing in, and 3 of them I hired. And we were blown away. That was far and away the easiest hiring we had ever done. I mean, it's a really good ratio. If you ever hired, it's a very good ratio. And we started thinking maybe we should do an experiment. So we did an experiment. I sat down, kind of by myself, and I spent 3 months, and I wrote the first version of the system. And we tried it out, and we saw how it did, and we compared it to the existing system, and we read it, and we thought about it. We kind of slowly expanded from there. Right? There was no big bang where we said, all right, that's it. Everything gets switched over. But to be clear, from the beginning, I mean, the job security thing was kind of a joke. From the beginning, part of the attraction of using OCaml was the ability to hire people. So it's weird and it's counterintuitive because many people think that's the problem. That's why you can't do this. But in many ways, we found it to be an advantage.
It might also fit into scale.
Oh, yeah, right. I mean,
to hire, not 3 or 4 people,
right.
Sure.
When we need to hire 500 people, they're probably not all going to be people who know ML on the way in. But you know what? You can teach people ML if they're good, right? I mean, one of the luxuries we have is we don't hire bad programmers, right? And if you don't hire bad programmers, many things become easier, right?
I think there was one more question. Wait,
So Microsoft is trying to solve all your problems that you mentioned with Sharp. So,
yes. So,
are you willing to go back to...
So, let me say a number of things about F#. First of all, it seems great. Like, in many ways, I think this could be like the way in which these languages reach the mainstream, and I think that's fantastic. And I think Donsheim has done a great job. There are a few issues that make me not so excited about F#. As an alternative to what we do. First of all, we have 1 million lines of code. And you know what? We use functors and polymorphic variants and labels, and yeah, you can just forget it. Right? There's just no, the effort required to port it is just not worth it. Secondly, F# does not perform well for symbolic code. And the reason is it has to allocate too much because it's a functional programming language. So one of the things that Donsheim said is, and this may get better, to be clear, but one of the things Donsheim pointed out early on is that when he tried to explain to the people who worked on the C# runtime that their allocator wasn't fast enough, and they looked at his allocation rates, and they just dismissed it because allocation rates that high are clearly an indication of a bug in the program. There's no point, right? And for Java, that's true. You don't allocate things at anything like this rate. So the GC that you need to do well in a language like ML is just very different than the GC that you need to do there. The other thing which I learned recently about F#, and I'm not 100% sure this is true, so I don't want to libel F#, but one of the things that made me very sad to discover, to really hear repeated to me recently, is that F# kind of still has the null problem that Java and C# has, which is that anything can still be null. Now, if you only write nice, well-behaved sort of ML code in the ML subset, and you never touch the .NET libraries, everything's cool. But the moment you go and make a call to .NET and say, please get this string from me off the wire, and it returns a string to you, that string might be null. Right? And one of the things I really like about ML is not having to worry about null anymore. And so that's, to me, a big drawback. Also, I don't know how this works out, but I worry about the lack of functors. It's not, so I know that Don claims that the object system fills in many of the problems that you would have, that you would normally do with functors, and maybe that's right. I haven't thought about it carefully enough, and I haven't looked close enough at how F# works. I see lots of people shaking their heads. But in any case, for all those reasons, we're more comfortable with OCaml. Also, we really like developing systems on Unix. There's all sorts of things we don't like about Windows for these kind of applications. If you've ever had to try to get a precise time of day out of a Windows machine, you will understand one of the good reasons not to use Windows for high-performance trading systems. So.
All right, great. So thank you very much. Let me, I'm sorry, hold on just 1 second. I just wanted to thank Carl Curry and Bob Harper for suggesting the speaker. I thought it was great. And Ron, thank you very much for a great talk. Thank you.